March 7, 2025. Inside South Carolina's Broad River Correctional Institution, Brad Sigman faced the final day of his life. At 67 years old, he knew there were no more appeals waiting, no unexpected phone call that would change what had already been decided. Before anything else happened, he spent precious moments with the people who mattered most to him. They stood separated by a sheet of glass, exchanging words that would become their last conversation. No embrace was possible, no handshake, only faces looking back at one another, knowing the next goodbye would be permanent. For more than 20 years, Sigmon had lived on South Carolina's death row after being convicted of murdering his former girlfriend's parents in 2001. He admitted responsibility for the killings and, according to those who knew him during his incarceration, often spoke of the remorse he carried throughout those years. By the time that March morning arrived, he understood exactly where the day would end. The only thing left was deciding how to spend the hours that remained. That is what makes this story different. It is not only the account of an execution or the legal process that led to it. It is the story of the choices made during one final day, the conversations shared when time was almost gone, and the quiet moments that unfolded before the prison doors opened for the last time. Long before witnesses entered the execution chamber, Brad Sigman's final chapter had already begun, revealing details that continue to raise difficult questions about justice, remorse, faith, and what remains of a person's humanity when the clock finally runs out. March 7, 2025, began with certainty, not surprise. Inside Broad River Correctional Institution, Brad Sigman woke knowing every remaining hour had already been measured. Years of appeals, hearings, and legal arguments had narrowed into one final day. The prison followed its routine, yet nothing about that morning felt ordinary. Before officials prepared the execution chamber, Sigmon spent time with spiritual advisors who had visited him throughout his incarceration. Public statements later described conversations focused less on fear than on the people he would leave behind. Rather than dwelling on himself, he reportedly asked how his family might endure the loss. That perspective, supporters argued, reflected years of personal change. Critics, however, never forgot the devastating crimes that placed him on death row. In 2001, he was convicted of murdering his former girlfriend's parents. Those facts remained undisputed, even as people debated whether genuine remorse could coexist with irreversible violence. One detail from his final preparations drew widespread attention. Reports indicated that his requested last meal included fried chicken, green beans, mashed potatoes, biscuits, cheesecake, and sweet tea. His attorney also said Sigmon hoped to share food with other condemned prisoners, illustrating, at least in intention, a final gesture toward community. He reportedly emptied his commissary account before the execution, giving away what little remained. Friends, lawyers, and faith leaders later described him as someone who encouraged fellow inmates, listened patiently, and prayed with those facing similar sentences. Whether those actions changed public opinion is another question entirely. Yet they became an important part of the story surrounding his final day. As the afternoon advanced, every remaining decision had already been made. Only time continued moving forward, carrying everyone inside the prison toward an ending that would soon become a lasting chapter in American capital punishment history. The next moments would draw national attention because South Carolina planned to carry out an execution by firing squad, the first such method used in the United States in 15 years. Sigmon selected that option after rejecting the electric chair and lethal injection under the circumstances presented to him. His attorneys argued the available choices were deeply troubling. State officials maintained the sentence followed lawful procedures. Across the country, reactions remained sharply divided, ensuring the final hours would be examined from every possible angle long after they had passed into history, leaving difficult questions about punishment, redemption, responsibility, and memory for generations to consider. As the afternoon unfolded, the legal process reached its final conclusion. Brad Sigman's attorneys pursued every remaining avenue available, asking courts to intervene before the scheduled execution. Those efforts ultimately failed. The Supreme Court declined to block the sentence, and South Carolina Governor Henry McMaster denied clemency. With those decisions, Every legal option had been exhausted, leaving prison officials to continue with the execution according to the established timetable. Inside Broad River Correctional Institution, preparations moved carefully and deliberately. Sigmon was escorted from death row to the execution chamber, a short distance that marked the final walk of a life shaped by decades of imprisonment. Witnesses would later describe an atmosphere of complete silence, where even ordinary movements seemed unusually deliberate. Everyone present understood the significance of what was about to happen. Before the execution began, Sigmon was secured in the specially designed chair used for the firing squad procedure. Officials placed a target over his chest to identify the intended point of impact. Witnesses observed that he remained composed throughout the preparations. His attorney stood among those permitted to watch, joined by representatives of the victim's family, members of the media, law enforcement personnel, and other authorized observers separated from the chamber by protective glass. Sigmon prepared a final statement that was read shortly before the sentence was carried out. Rather than focusing on his own fate, he expressed love for his family, spoke about his Christian faith, and urged others to reconsider the use of the death penalty. He acknowledged the importance of grace and forgiveness, reflecting beliefs he had publicly discussed during his years in prison. His words became one of the most widely reported moments of the entire execution. When everything was ready, the chamber fell completely quiet. After a brief pause, the concealed firing squad carried out the sentence. Witnesses later described the sound of the rifles as sudden and startling. Medical personnel entered the chamber shortly afterward, conducted the required examination, and officially pronounced Brad Sigman dead at 6:08 p.m. on March 7, 2025. His execution marked South Carolina's first use of a firing squad and the first firing squad execution carried out anywhere in the United States since 2010, immediately becoming a significant moment in the continuing national debate surrounding capital punishment. News of Brad Sigman's execution spread quickly beyond the prison walls. Outside Broad River Correctional Institution, supporters of the death penalty and opponents of capital punishment gathered within sight of the facility, each interpreting the outcome through a very different lens. For some, the sentence represented justice finally carried out after more than 2 decades. For others, it raised difficult questions about whether any execution, regardless of the crime, could truly serve the cause of justice. Among those reflecting on Sigman's final years were members of his legal team and religious leaders who had visited him regularly. They described a man who devoted much of his time in prison to Bible study, prayer, and conversations with other inmates facing long sentences or execution. According to those who knew him during that period, he tried to offer encouragement to people living under the same uncertainty that had once defined his own future. Those accounts did not erase the pain suffered by the victim's family, but they became part of the public discussion surrounding who Brad Sigman had become during more than 20 years on death row. One of the final personal belongings associated with Sigman also carried symbolic meaning. Before his execution, he gave away the Bible he had read throughout his incarceration, entrusting it to someone he believed would continue sharing its message. For those close to him, that gesture reflected the faith that had shaped his later years. For others, it stood as another reminder of the complicated legacy left behind by a man whose life would always be defined by both a terrible crime and the years that followed it. History will remember March 7, 2025, for more than one reason. It marked the return of the firing squad as an execution method in the United States after a 15-year absence. It also ensured that Brad Sigman's final hours would remain part of broader conversations about punishment, accountability, remorse, and redemption. Whether people view his story through the perspective of justice, mercy, or public policy, it continues to challenge simple conclusions. Sometimes the most enduring questions are not about how a life ends, but about everything that happens before the final moment arrives, and what those final choices reveal about the human condition itself. Brad Sigman's final day remains one of the most discussed chapters in the modern history of capital punishment. His final hours included conversations with loved ones, expressions of faith, and choices that continue to be examined alongside the crime that brought him to death row. None of those moments erase the devastating loss suffered by the victim's family, nor do they settle the larger debate surrounding justice and the death penalty. Instead, They leave behind difficult questions that every viewer must answer for themselves. If this story made you stop and think, share your perspective respectfully in the comments below. How should society balance accountability, punishment, remorse, and the possibility of personal change? If you appreciate carefully researched true crime documentaries that focus on the facts behind the headlines, subscribe to Court of Secrets and join us for more stories that challenge assumptions and explore the human side of the justice system.